Do you believe that some killers spread terror, only to vanish as if they never existed? No clues, no faces, no arrests. From the empty streets of India, to the shadowy woods of America, to the lively bars of Scotland, history has left behind 15 chilling cases where the murderer remains nothing more than a phantom. They're remembered by haunting names: the Zodiac, the Phantom Killer, Bible John, the Stone Man. Names that feel both distant and familiar, because behind them lies a fear shared by entire communities. In this video, we'll step into 15 unsolved mysteries, 15 haunting stories that have stretched across decades, to understand why, even today, these phantom killers still send shivers down the world's spine. Jack the Ripper, the most famous unsolved serial killer in history. London, late 19th century. In the dark, foggy streets of the East End, one name spread fear across the entire city and left behind a mystery that has lasted for more than a century. Jack the Ripper. No one truly knows who he was. No one understands his real motives. But one thing is certain. His story has become one of the most infamous and haunting unsolved cases in human history. To understand why this case left such a deep mark, we need to step back to London in 1888. Whitechapel, a working-class district overcrowded with small, damp houses, poverty, disease, and crime. In the middle of this chaos, a series of strange murders suddenly began. The community, already living in fear, now faced sheer panic. Within just a few months, the London police recorded several attacks on women in the area. Newspapers quickly picked up the story, linking the incidents together. That's when the idea of a shadowy killer began to take shape. Soon, a name appeared: Jack the Ripper. It didn't come from the police, but from letters sent to newspapers and investigators, signed with that chilling alias. These letters taunted the authorities and deepened the city's fear. But were they really written by the killer? Or just the work of someone trying to exploit the chaos? That question remains unanswered to this day. The police launched one of the largest investigations of the 19th century. Hundreds were questioned. Doctors, butchers, sailors, even members of the upper class were considered suspects. Many researchers believed the killer had medical knowledge, or at least some skill in anatomy, based on the way he acted. But in the 1880s, forensic science was still primitive. No DNA testing, no fingerprints, no cameras. Investigators relied almost entirely on witness statements, most of which were vague or unreliable. In the end, no one was ever convicted. The killer simply vanished. Over the years, countless theories have tried to answer the question: who was Jack the Ripper? Some believe he was a doctor or a medical student. Others claim he was a member of the aristocracy, even tied to the British royal family. Some argue he was a foreigner who slipped away after the crimes. And still others suggest a simpler explanation: that he was just an ordinary man living quietly in Whitechapel, hidden among thousands of struggling Londoners. Modern technology has attempted to solve the mystery. DNA tests on an old piece of fabric once pointed to a specific suspect. But experts quickly challenged the findings, calling the evidence weak and possibly contaminated after more than a century. To this day, Jack the Ripper's identity remains nothing more than speculation. What is certain, however, is the cultural impact of his name. Jack the Ripper has inspired countless books, films, documentaries, and academic studies. In the minds of many, he is more than just an unidentified killer. He has become a symbol of mystery, of unsolved crimes, and of humanity's collective fear of the unknown. More than 130 years have passed. The world has changed. But the question remains: who was Jack the Ripper? Perhaps one day, science will finally uncover the truth. Or perhaps this mystery will forever remain hidden in the fog of London. And maybe that's why his legend endures, a shadow that refuses to fade from human imagination. So what do you think? Was Jack the Ripper just an ordinary man lost in the crowd? Or was he part of a much bigger secret that the world was never meant to know? Zodiac Killer, America's most mysterious serial killer. In the late 1960s, while America was alive with rock music, anti-war protests, and the hippie movement, a name emerged in California that would cast a shadow of terror, a name that, more than half a century later, still has no answer: the Zodiac Killer. Unlike criminals who hide in the dark, the Zodiac chose to make himself the center of attention. He taunted the press and the police, signing his letters with a strange symbol, a circle with a cross through it. That symbol became his mark, his logo, forever tied to the name Zodiac. These letters contained not only threats, but also cryptic ciphers, puzzles designed to draw the entire society into a twisted game. Under public pressure, newspapers at the time were forced to publish his words in full. And with that, the identity of the faceless killer spread across America. The Zodiac was believed to strike several times around the San Francisco Bay Area. Witnesses and police reports gave conflicting descriptions, sometimes a middle-aged man, sometimes younger. It even seemed as though he deliberately left behind false impressions, making it nearly impossible to pin down who he really was. What made the Zodiac infamous wasn't just his crimes, but his ciphers. For decades, professional cryptographers, amateur sleuths, and entire online communities have tried to decode his messages. A few have been solved, revealing disturbing and taunting statements. But at least one major cipher still remains unsolved to this day. So who was the Zodiac? That's the question that keeps the case alive. Police investigated dozens of suspects. One of the most infamous was Arthur Lee Allen, a schoolteacher whom many believed fit the profile. Yet without solid evidence, he was never charged. Other suspects emerged over the years, men with strange histories, names flagged by investigators, and even individuals pointed out by online communities. But each lead ended in dead ends. Some believe the Zodiac was a brilliant manipulator, someone with a deep knowledge of language, codes, and media psychology. A man who knew exactly how to turn fear into a weapon. Others suggest he wasn't a genius at all, perhaps not even one person, but rather a collection of unrelated crimes bundled together under one terrifying name. What turned the Zodiac into more than just a killer was his transformation into an icon of modern mystery. His story has been immortalized in books, films, and even music. David Fincher's 2007 film Zodiac reignited public fascination with the case, while online forums and YouTube channels continue to dissect every clue. There are people who have devoted their entire lives to solving his ciphers, yet the final pieces remain missing. Now, more than 50 years later, the case files are fading, the witnesses are gone, but the name Zodiac endures, a ghost haunting the history of American crime. Perhaps what makes him immortal is not what he did, but what he left behind: silence. No final answer, no definitive truth, just a void, one that humanity keeps trying to fill with theories, fear, and endless curiosity. The Zodiac killer remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. And the final question for you is this: was Zodiac truly a hidden genius who outsmarted the entire legal system, or just an ordinary person who managed to vanish in the chaos of the era? The Axeman of New Orleans, jazz, fear, and unsolved murders. New Orleans, the city of jazz and endless festivals, once went through a time overshadowed by fear and dread. Between 1918 and 1919, a series of mysterious attacks shook the community, especially Italian immigrant families. The figure behind these events was soon given a chilling name: the Axeman of New Orleans. What unsettled people wasn't only the brutality of the crimes, but the strange way they were carried out. The Axeman rarely brought his own weapon. Instead, he used the very axes, knives, or household tools found in the victims' homes before vanishing without a trace. No clear evidence, no convincing leads, just fear that lingered in every corner of the city. While police struggled with scattered clues, an event pushed the case into the realm of legend. On March 13, 1919, a local newspaper received a bizarre letter, allegedly from the Axeman himself. In it, he claimed to be a spirit from hell, mocked the police, and threatened to strike again. But one line stood out: any home filled with the sound of jazz music on the following night would be spared. That night, the city transformed. Bars, clubs, restaurants, and even ordinary households filled the air with jazz until dawn. Lively music spilled into the streets, turning a night of terror into an eerie celebration. And, astonishingly, just as the letter had promised, no attack took place. The event became one of New Orleans' most memorable legends, when music itself became a shield against death. But who was the Axeman? Theories abound. Some believe he was truly a serial killer targeting Italian immigrants. Others argue the attacks were unrelated crimes, exaggerated and pieced together by newspapers into one larger narrative. Many even question whether the infamous letter was really his. Perhaps it was just a cruel prank or a sensational stunt by the press. Whatever the truth, no one was ever caught, and the Axeman disappeared as suddenly as he had arrived. More than a century later, the Axeman still lingers in popular culture. Books, films, and even jazz songs recall a city trembling in fear, yet united in music. He is no longer just a name in criminal history, but part of the mythos of New Orleans, a place where fact, fear, and folklore intertwine. We may never know who the Axeman truly was, or what drove him, but his story endures as one of America's strangest true crime mysteries, where jazz, terror, and legend came together in a night the city will never forget. Servant Girl Annihilator, America's first unsolved serial killer. Austin, Texas, in the late 19th century. Back then, the city was still small, dusty dirt roads, simple wooden houses, and the calm atmosphere of a community slowly growing. But in 1884, a strange terror began to cast its shadow over Austin. A series of mysterious attacks took place, and the figure behind them was soon given a haunting name: the Servant Girl Annihilator. The nickname came from the fact that many of the first victims were young women, often working as servants in households across the city. The attacks happened at night, sudden and brutal, leaving no clear trace of the assailant. Despite the police throwing in all their efforts, fear spread quickly through the community. What makes this case even more striking is the context of the time. Austin was still frontier-like, with limited investigative tools and almost no modern surveillance. Even the very concept of a serial killer did not exist yet in law enforcement or the media. And so, these crimes not only brought terror, but also confusion. People had no words to even describe what was happening. The local press began reporting heavily, and soon newspapers outside Texas labeled Austin as the city of fear. Families changed their daily lives. Windows were reinforced, fences were built higher, and people avoided going out after dark. But the most chilling part of all was how it ended. After a wave of brutal killings between 1884 and 1885, the attacks suddenly stopped. No arrests, no confessions, no evidence strong enough to name a suspect. The killer simply vanished. Over the years, theories began to emerge. Some believed the Servant Girl Annihilator was just one deeply disturbed man who later left Austin and continued his crimes elsewhere. Others went further, suggesting a shocking possibility. Could this very killer have later become Jack the Ripper in London? While no proof exists, the timing, Austin's murders ending just before the infamous killings in England began, has kept this theory alive for decades. On the other hand, some argue the story might not belong to one man at all. Perhaps multiple crimes by different people were woven together by rumor and sensationalist newspapers, unintentionally creating the legend of a single faceless killer. Weak evidence, coupled with the primitive investigative system of the 19th century, left the truth buried in history. Today, the Servant Girl Annihilator is remembered as the first uncaught serial killer in American history. His crimes reveal not only the limits of early law enforcement, but also how humans react when faced with something they cannot explain. A small, unsuspecting community, unprepared for the idea of serial murder, was shaken by sleepless nights, spreading rumors, and unspoken fears. Nearly 140 years later, the Servant Girl Annihilator's name still echoes in history books and true crime programs. Yet what makes this story so haunting is not the brutality itself, but the silence that followed. No one knows who he was. No one knows why he stopped. And no one knows if he continued his reign of terror somewhere else in the world. Sometimes, it is the unanswered questions that make a story live on. And the Servant Girl Annihilator is exactly that, a ghost of history, both real and legendary, leaving behind one of the most enduring mysteries in American crime. Cleveland Torso Murderer, the Mad Butcher who vanished. In the mid-1930s, Cleveland, Ohio, was a city in transition. The Great Depression had left thousands unemployed, and shantytowns spread across the city's edges. In this bleak setting, a name emerged that would forever haunt American crime history: the Cleveland Torso Murderer, more chillingly known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The murders took place between 1935 and 1938. The victims were almost always from society's margins: the homeless, the jobless, the forgotten. This made investigations harder, as many victims were never even identified. The name, torso murderer, came from the gruesome condition in which many bodies were discovered: dismembered, incomplete. Yet beyond the horror itself, some investigators believe the killer was sending a message. By targeting people no one seemed to notice, was he hiding his true identity? Or was it his way of taunting the police? Public fear grew quickly, especially when the case attracted national attention. And at its center was none other than Eliot Ness, the legendary lawman who had helped bring down Al Capone. Now serving as Cleveland's safety director, Ness launched aggressive measures, even ordering the destruction of parts of Kingsbury Run's shantytown to drive out vagrants and cut off possible hiding places for the killer. But despite Ness's reputation, the case never found closure. Suspects came and went, but no evidence was ever strong enough for a conviction. One name stood out: Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, a local physician with military background, surgical knowledge, and a history of mental illness. Ness himself was convinced Sweeney was the killer. But politics, legal barriers, and the lack of solid evidence kept the doctor out of court. Officially, the case remained unsolved. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the killing stopped. After 1938, no new victims were linked to the Mad Butcher. Why? Did the killer leave Cleveland? Did he die? Or did he simply adapt, continuing his crimes elsewhere under a different pattern? Nearly a century later, the debate continues. Some remain convinced Sweeney was the murderer. Others argue the truth was never uncovered, that the torso murders were the work of someone else entirely, perhaps even more than one person during those desperate Depression years. What is certain is the impact the case left behind. It exposed the limitations of 1930s law enforcement, at a time when forensic science was still primitive. It also reflected the harsh realities of an American city gripped by poverty, crime, and growing distrust in justice. Today, the Cleveland torso murderer remains one of the darkest mysteries in U.S. history. No trial, no confession, no closure. Only dusty police files, yellowed newspaper clippings, and a name that still chills anyone who hears it. And in the end, the haunting question remains: what became of the Mad Butcher? Did he truly stop? Or did he simply continue elsewhere, under a new name, in a different city? The Monster of Florence, Italy's unsolved serial killer case. Florence, a name that usually evokes art, Renaissance architecture, and timeless masterpieces. Yet few would expect that the very city known as the cultural heart of Italy became the stage for one of the most chilling and mysterious crimes in 20th century Europe. Locals gave him an unsettling name: Il Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence. The murders spanned nearly 2 decades, from 1968 to 1985. The killer targeted young couples who often drove to the outskirts of Florence for privacy. The method of killing showed consistent patterns, convincing investigators that these were not isolated crimes, but the work of the same individual, or possibly a group. From the very beginning, fear gripped Italy. Florence, a peaceful city and a destination for millions of tourists, suddenly became synonymous with terror. People avoided going out at night. Couples grew wary of meeting in secluded places, and the press reported endlessly on the Monster of Florence, as though he were a phantom no one could touch. Italian police launched one of the largest investigations in the nation's history. Hundreds of suspects were interrogated, thousands of pages of reports were filed. But the deeper they dug, the more tangled the case became. Some believed the culprit was a lone madman. Others suggested the involvement of an organized group, even linking the murders to occult rituals. One prominent suspect was a farmer named Pietro Pacciani, who had a criminal record and lived near several of the crime scenes. Authorities believed they had their man, but the trial was riddled with contradictions. Pacciani was convicted, then acquitted, and the case returned to square one. Ironically, after his death, the monster's killings had already long ceased, raising the question: was Pacciani truly the murderer, or just a pawn in a much larger game? Over time, theories multiplied: a lone killer, a satanic cult, or even powerful figures within Italian society. Journalists and the public kept digging, but every answer only produced more questions. What cemented the case's legend was its silence. After 1985, no more murders occurred. The monster of Florence simply vanished. Had he died, been imprisoned for another crime, or merely stopped because his purpose was fulfilled? No one knows for sure. To this day, the case remains unsolved. It has inspired novels, films, and academic studies in criminal psychology. Many Florentines, especially those who lived through the 1970s and 1980s, still recall the dread that swept over the city whenever night fell. In a place where every stone carries history, perhaps the monster of Florence, too, has become part of the city's collective memory, a dark, unfinished chapter. And the final question lingers still. Who was the monster of Florence? A flesh-and-blood killer, or a haunting metaphor for a society on the verge of fracture? Highway of Tears, Canada's unsolved murders of missing women. There is a road in Canada that stretches for hundreds of kilometers, cutting through dense forests, rugged mountains, and desolate landscapes. To tourists, it may seem like just another highway, but for many families, it is forever tied to grief and fear. They call it the Highway of Tears. Since the late 1960s, along Highway 16 in British Columbia, dozens of women, most of them Indigenous, have vanished or been found murdered under mysterious circumstances. The exact number remains unclear. Police acknowledge more than 18 victims, but local communities believe the true figure could be dozens, even hundreds. What many of these cases have in common is chilling. Women disappearing while hitchhiking or traveling down isolated stretches of road. In remote parts of Canada, where public transportation is scarce, hitchhiking is often the only option, but it also makes women an easy target. For decades, Canadian authorities have launched investigations, even forming a special task force called the Highway of Tears. Yet progress has been painfully slow. Only a handful of cases have been solved, while the majority remain shrouded in mystery. This failure has sparked outrage. How could so many women vanish, yet so few answers emerge? Activists in Indigenous communities point to a deeper issue: systemic inequality. They argue that because most victims were poor Indigenous women from remote settlements, their cases were not given the same urgency or attention. Both the media and the justice system have been accused of neglect, turning the Highway of Tears into a national wound that refuses to heal. The mystery only deepens with conflicting theories. Some believe a single serial killer has stalked the highway for years. Others think multiple predators have taken advantage of the isolation. Still more suspect connections to human trafficking. But none of these theories has ever been proven. The Highway of Tears, then, is more than a true crime story. It is a mirror reflecting society's failures, raising questions about women's safety, about communities left behind, and about a justice system that has struggled to protect the most vulnerable. Today, signs have been posted along the highway warning women not to hitchhike. Families of victims, advocacy groups, and filmmakers continue to speak out, determined to keep the memory alive. Yet the pain lingers. The questions remain unanswered. Who is responsible for these disappearances? Why have so many women vanished along this single stretch of road? And when, if ever, will justice come for the families who still wait? The Highway of Tears remains one of Canada's darkest mysteries, a road that connects towns, but also carries decades of sorrow that time has yet to wash away. Long Island serial killer, the Gilgo Beach mystery. On the shores of Long Island, just a short drive away from bustling New York City, lies a mystery that has haunted America for years. It is known as the case of the Long Island serial killer, or, more chillingly, the Gilgo Beach mystery. The story began in 2010, when police were searching for a missing woman. But instead of finding a single clue, they uncovered multiple human remains buried along the sandy stretches near Ocean Parkway. To this day, at least 10 victims have been officially confirmed, though many believe the true number could be far higher. Most of the victims shared haunting similarities: young women, living in vulnerable circumstances. Many worked in the service industry or used social media to connect with clients. This detail led investigators to believe the killer was deliberate, calculating, and disturbingly skilled at choosing and concealing his targets. For years, the case spiraled into a maze of dead ends. Suspects emerged: a former police officer, local community figures, even shadowy online personas. But hard evidence remained scarce. The silence that stretched over more than a decade fueled public suspicion. Did the killer have powerful connections? Or specialized knowledge about how to evade detection? Some even speculated that more than one predator could have been at work. It wasn't until 2022 to 2023 that the investigation took a dramatic turn. Authorities arrested Rex Heuermann, an architect living in Long Island. He was charged in connection with several victims, based on DNA and cell phone evidence. And yet, even with this arrest, questions linger. Was Heuermann the sole perpetrator? Or just one piece of a much larger, darker puzzle? What makes this case so chilling is not only the number of victims, but the vulnerability it exposes. For decades, these crimes unfolded in the shadow of one of the world's busiest cities, and still, the killer or killers managed to remain hidden. Today, Gilgo Beach is not just a destination for visitors, but a symbol of one of modern America's darkest unsolved mysteries. Documentaries, books, and podcasts have delved deep into the case, but much of it remains speculation. Which leaves us with one final, unsettling question. Will the Gilgo Beach mystery ever be fully solved? Or will it remain forever, a ghost drifting between the white sands and restless waves of Long Island? West Mesa Bone Collector, 11 bodies, no killer found. In 2009, a chilling discovery shook the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. A man was walking his dog across a barren stretch of land in West Mesa when the animal stumbled upon something protruding from the ground. Police were called to the scene, and what they uncovered would reveal one of America's darkest unsolved mysteries. As investigators dug deeper, they found not just one, but 11 human remains scattered across the desolate field. All of them were women, most of them young. Many reported missing between 2003 and 2005. A grim pattern soon emerged. The victims came from vulnerable backgrounds. Some had struggled with addiction, others were involved in sex work. For years, their disappearances had gone largely unnoticed, until the desert itself gave up their secrets. The discovery sparked a massive investigation. Yet more than a decade later, the identity of the killer, or killers, remains unknown. Several theories have surfaced. Some believe it was the work of a single serial killer living in Albuquerque, targeting women who were the easiest to prey upon. Others suspect organized crime, using West Mesa as a dumping ground. A handful of names even surfaced as possible suspects. One died before he could ever be questioned, but no concrete evidence has ever tied anyone to the murders. What's most haunting is how the case came to light at all. In 2009, a severe drought caused Albuquerque's groundwater levels to drop, making the soil collapse and exposing the bones. Was it pure coincidence? Or fate, forcing this buried secret into the open? To this day, the case remains active. Police still ask for the public's help, while the victims' families continue to fight, so their loved ones are not forgotten in an endless file of unsolved crimes. And so, the ultimate question lingers. Who was the West Mesa Bone Collector? A lone predator? A group with darker motives? Or something far more complex? On that desolate patch of desert, 11 lives were silenced, but the truth remains buried. Even now, the name West Mesa Bone Collector hangs over Albuquerque like a ghost, haunting, enigmatic, and unsolved. Charlie Chopoff, the child killer who disappeared. New York City in the early 1970s was a place drowning in chaos. Street crime was rampant, gangs and drugs plagued neighborhoods, and murders seemed to happen almost daily. Amid this turbulence, a particularly gruesome series of crimes targeting children shook the entire city. The press gave the unknown killer a chilling name, Charlie Chopoff. The crimes began in 1972. The victims were all young boys, most from poor communities, often Black or Latino, groups that were largely overlooked by society at the time. What terrified the public most was the randomness of the attacks. They struck without warning, and the perpetrator vanished immediately afterward, leaving police with almost no clues. In response, the NYPD launched a massive investigation. Hundreds of suspects were scrutinized, from convicted sex offenders to drifters loitering near the crime scenes. One name soon stood out: Ernesto Soto, a man with a history of mental illness who had reportedly confessed to doctors that he might have been involved. In 1974, Soto was arrested after another attempted assault occurred. Yet the justice system of that era lacked the tools to convict him. There was no DNA evidence, no surveillance cameras, and witness testimonies were inconsistent. Some detectives were convinced Soto was the killer. Others believed his statements were merely symptoms of his mental disorder, not proof of guilt. What unsettled many, however, was that the murders abruptly stopped after Soto's arrest. This led to the haunting question: did the case end there, or was it only coincidence? To this day, criminologists and investigators remain divided. Some argue Soto was indeed the culprit, but was never formally convicted. Others suggest the real killer might have been jailed for a different crime, left the city, or even died. Another theory is that multiple perpetrators were responsible, but the media and public fused the crimes under one terrifying label: Charlie Chop-Off. No matter which theory holds true, one fact remains: no definitive answer has ever been found. The case highlights the limitations of 1970s law enforcement. Without DNA testing, widespread surveillance, or organized criminal databases, police struggled to connect the dots. In that void, the media transformed a string of brutal crimes into a dark legend, where the name invoked more fear than it ever provided answers. Charlie Chop-Off, whether man or myth, haunts the annals of American crime. No one knows his true identity. He could have been Erno Soto, someone else entirely, or perhaps the truth was lost forever. The case reminds us that not every mystery ends with resolution. Some criminal shadows simply fade away, leaving behind decades of lingering dread. And even today, the question still echoes: was Charlie Chop-Off a real killer, or just a name born from the collective fear of an entire city? The Doodler, San Francisco's unsolved gay serial killer. San Francisco in the 1970s was a city in transition. It was the era when the LGBTQ+ liberation movement began to flourish, especially in the Castro district, where the community found a rare sense of freedom. But in the shadows of late-night bars and secluded beaches, a mysterious killer emerged, spreading fear that remains unsolved to this day. People gave him a strange name: the Doodler. The name came from a chilling detail. According to witnesses, the killer would approach victims by sketching their portraits on napkins or in a sketchbook. With his artistic talent, he drew curiosity and trust before luring men away from the bar. But what started as a simple drawing would end in blood. Between 1974 and 1975, at least 14 gay men were murdered in San Francisco. Their bodies were discovered in parks, beaches, or private apartments. Despite the pattern, police struggled with the investigation. The problem wasn't just the lack of evidence, it was the heavy stigma of the time. Many witnesses and even surviving victims refused to come forward, terrified that revealing their identities in court would mean losing their jobs, their families, or their place in society. That silence was a crucial reason the case stalled. Police did gather some leads. Witnesses described the suspect as a young black man, between 19 and 25 years old, thin, and skilled at drawing. Yet in a society burdened with both racism and homophobia, many of these testimonies were dismissed or deemed unreliable. Some victims survived. Rumors even suggested that one survivor was a well-known figure in the entertainment world, but out of fear of career destruction, he refused to testify. This left the Doodler as an untouchable shadow, with a face, with a name, but never enough to convict. Then, in 1975, the killings abruptly stopped. No one knows why. Some say the murderer was jailed for another crime. Others believe he simply left the city. Perhaps the growing media attention forced him to stop. Or maybe he vanished, taking his secret with him to the grave. In recent years, thanks to advances in DNA technology and renewed interest from the LGBTQ+ community, the case has been reopened. The San Francisco police even released an updated sketch of what the suspect might look like today. Yet so far, there has been no breakthrough. What makes the case so haunting is not just the murders, but how society itself played a role. If not for the prejudice against the gay community at the time, more witnesses might have spoken out, and the killer could have been caught. Instead, fear and silence kept the truth buried, leaving behind one of America's most unsettling unsolved crimes. The Doodler is more than just a mystery. He is a reflection of a moment in history, when San Francisco was bursting with freedom, yet still chained by prejudice. And after more than 40 years, one question continues to echo. Who was the Doodler? Is he still alive somewhere? carrying a secret the world was never meant to know? The Colonial Parkway Killer, Lover's Lane murders still unsolved. Virginia, late 1980s. Along Colonial Parkway, a quiet, scenic, 23-mile stretch winding through forests and waterways, couples often came to seek privacy, to talk, and to share romantic moments. But within just a few short years, this so-called Lover's Lane turned into the backdrop for one of America's most haunting true crime mysteries. Between 1986 and 1989, at least 4 couples, 8 people in total, vanished or were brutally murdered under strange circumstances. To this day, the identity of the killer remains unknown. The press and locals gave him a chilling name, the Colonial Parkway Killer. What makes the case so disturbing is the lack of clear connection between the victims. Aside from being young couples, nothing tied them together, except that their lives ended on or near Colonial Parkway. Their cars were often found abandoned by the roadside, with baffling details left behind. In many cases, there were no signs of robbery, no evidence of a struggle, and the scenes left investigators deeply puzzled. Theories quickly emerged. Some believed the killer might have been a law enforcement officer, or someone impersonating one. Many of the vehicles were discovered neatly pulled over, as if the victims had calmly complied with a traffic stop. If true, that theory raised terrifying possibilities. The murderer may have used the trust and authority to lure his victims. Others suggested there may have been more than one killer, a string of copycats. By the late 1980s, the term serial killer was becoming a media fixation, and some argue that other criminals may have exploited the attention to commit similar crimes. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the murders stopped. After 1989, no new cases were linked to the Colonial Parkway Killer. Why? Some speculate he was arrested for another crime, moved away, or even died. Others believe he simply chose to vanish into the shadows, taking his secret with him. The FBI still keeps the case open. Advances in DNA testing have been attempted, but evidence from the 1980s has not always been sufficient to yield results. Families of the victims continue to wait for answers, while for many in Virginia, the Parkway remains haunted by a ghost of fear and uncertainty. What makes the Colonial Parkway Killer so chilling is not just the violence. It's the way romance and tragedy collided. A road once known for love and intimacy became a stage for horror. And even now, no one can say for certain whether the killer still walks among us, or if he has long since disappeared. Over 3 decades later, Colonial Parkway is still a popular tourist route. By day, visitors drive through to admire the views of forest and water. But at night, as the road winds into silence and darkness, whispers return of the phantom killer who was never caught. The questions remain. Who was the Colonial Parkway Killer? A lone predator, or several? And will the truth ever come to light? The Phantom Killer, Texarkana Moonlight Murders Mystery. February 1946. Texarkana, a quiet town straddling the border between Texas and Arkansas, had just begun to settle into peace after World War II. But that peace was shattered when whispers of a terrifying name began to spread. The Phantom Killer, a shadowy figure who struck fear into the community under the light of the moon. Over the course of just a few months, a string of brutal attacks and murders unfolded in the outskirts of town, often targeting young couples seeking privacy at night. The press soon gave these events a haunting name: the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. What horrified residents most was the killer's unpredictability. He appeared suddenly, struck swiftly, and vanished into the darkness without leaving a clear trace. The few witnesses who survived described a chilling figure: a man wearing a cloth mask, a white sack with 2 holes cut out for eyes. That image, a faceless predator lurking in the night, quickly became a collective nightmare. Law enforcement mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Local police, Texas Rangers, and even the FBI joined the hunt. Checkpoints were set up, patrols increased, and residents were urged to remain cautious. Fear gripped Texarkana. Families bought guns, locked their doors, and imposed their own curfews. Even the local movie theater hung warning signs, reminding audiences of the danger of being outside at night. Despite all efforts, the Phantom Killer was never caught. Dozens of suspects were questioned, but one man stood out: Yowell Swinney, a petty criminal with a history of theft and violence. His wife gave statements suggesting he was involved, but at the time, the law did not allow a wife's testimony to be used against her husband. With little physical evidence, authorities couldn't tie him directly to the murders. Swinney was eventually jailed for car theft, but the question remained: was he truly the Phantom Killer? As years passed, theories multiplied. Some believed the Phantom Killer was indeed Swinney, and the murders stopped after his imprisonment. Others argued there were multiple attackers, a web of copycats muddying the case. Still others speculated that the true killer may have died, disappeared, or simply chosen to stop. What's remarkable is how such a brief reign of terror left a lasting scar on American culture. In 1976, the film The Town That Dreaded Sundown dramatized the case, cementing the Phantom's image in pop culture. Even today, Texarkana screens the film each year near the original crime scenes, both a remembrance and a confrontation with its darkest chapter. More than 7 decades later, the Texarkana Moonlight murders remain unsolved. Modern investigators have tried to use DNA technology, but the scarcity of viable evidence from 1946 has made it nearly impossible to find answers. And so, the legend endures. Was the Phantom Killer a single man, a group of copycats, or simply the manifestation of a community's deepest fears, amplified by the media? Texarkana has long moved forward, but the shadow of 1946 still lingers. The Phantom Killer was never caught, never unmasked, and his mystery remains one of the greatest true crime enigmas in American history. A final question echoes under the Texarkana moonlight. Will the Phantom's secret ever be uncovered, or will it remain forever hidden in the darkness? The Stone Man Killer, India's brutal and unsolved murders. Do you believe that in the heart of India's most crowded cities, there once lurked an invisible killer, a shadow who appeared and vanished like a ghost, leaving behind a trail of deaths that police have never solved? People called him by a chilling name, the Stone Man. In the late 1980s, Calcutta, now Kolkata, was a city where countless homeless people slept along the sidewalks. By day, the streets were alive with noise, but when night fell, they grew eerily silent. It was then that a series of strange and brutal deaths began to surface. The victims, mostly poor laborers and the homeless, were found in the morning, lying motionless beside a heavy stone. No cries for help, no witnesses, no signs of struggle, just the eerie presence of the stone itself. Within a few months, at least 12 people were killed in Calcutta. Fear spread quickly. Whispers of a serial killer hiding in the shadows dominated the city. Newspapers named him the Stone Man. But the nightmare didn't end there. Only a few years later, hundreds of kilometers away in Mumbai, the killings began again. The same pattern: victims sleeping on the streets, crushed or struck by a heavy rock. This time, between 9 and 13 people lost their lives. The question arose: was this the same killer traveling from one city to another? Or were multiple killers copying the same method, hiding their own crimes behind the legend of the Stone Man? Police in both cities launched intense manhunts. Dozens of suspects were arrested: petty criminals, drifters, even mentally unstable individuals. Yet every single one was released. No evidence, no confessions, no answers. Back then, forensic science was limited. There was no DNA testing, no CCTV cameras. And tragically, the victims came from society's most invisible group, the homeless poor. Their deaths went largely unnoticed, and justice slipped through the cracks. Some believe the Stone Man was real, a serial killer who preyed on the most vulnerable. Others argue it was never one person at all, but several criminals using the same method. And there are those who insist it was nothing more than an urban legend, exaggerated by the press, weaving together unrelated deaths into one haunting tale. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the killing stopped. By the early 1990s, the Stone Man vanished without a trace. No more bodies, no more stones, just silence. Even today, the story sends shivers down the spine. It stands as a reminder of the failures of law enforcement at the time, and of the painful truth that the poor often die without anyone fighting for their justice. The Stone Man has since become a dark symbol in India's urban folklore, immortalized in films, books, and whispered conversations on street corners long after midnight. More than 3 decades have passed, but the question remains: who was the Stone Man? A cold-blooded killer? A series of copycats? Or nothing more than fear itself, amplified into myth? Perhaps we will never know. But for those who lived through those long, anxious nights, the name Stone Man is a ghost that has never truly disappeared. Bible John, Scotland's most elusive serial killer. If you lived in Glasgow, Scotland, during the late 1960s, the name Bible John would likely stir a fear you could never forget. A man never identified, never caught. Yet his shadow still lingers to this day. He was given that chilling name because of one peculiar detail. He was said to have quoted the Bible while speaking to his victims. The story begins at the Barrowland Ballroom, a famous nightclub in Glasgow. It was a place where young people, singles, and even married couples came to dance and escape the grind of daily life. But behind the flashing lights and lively music, something sinister hid in the dark. Between 1968 and 1969, 3 women were murdered after leaving the Barrowland. The chilling common thread? Each was last seen with the same man. Tall, well-dressed, polite, his hair neatly combed. A key witness, the cousin of one of the victims, had spoken with him directly. She described a man who appeared respectable, even gentlemanly, but strangely severe. During their conversation, he condemned drinking, criticized moral weaknesses, and, most unsettling of all, quoted scripture. It was this eerie detail that led the press to call him Bible John. Police in Scotland launched one of the largest investigations in the nation's history. More than 50,000 men were questioned, and multiple composite sketches of the suspect were released. For a time, the imagined face of Bible John was everywhere, on the front pages of newspapers, pinned to police station walls, and etched deep in the public's imagination. Yet, despite the massive effort, the killer seemed to vanish into thin air. Why was it so difficult? First, forensic science in the late 1960s was limited. DNA testing simply didn't exist. Second, the crimes took place in crowded nightclubs with hundreds of strangers coming and going, making it nearly impossible to single out one man. And third, while eyewitness testimony was valuable, it remained frustratingly vague. Years later, as DNA technology advanced, investigators revisited the case. Suspicion once fell on Peter Tobin, a convicted murderer with a violent past. His age, appearance, and even his presence in Glasgow during the late 60s seemed to align with Bible John. Yet to this day, no definitive scientific proof has ever confirmed the connection. What makes the case even more chilling is that Bible John never struck again after 1969. The murders simply stopped. Did he die? Did he move elsewhere? Or was he, all along, someone hiding in plain sight? A man with a family, a job, and a secret darkness no one ever uncovered? The mystery endures because it blurs the line between fact and folklore. Decades later, even the mention of Bible John still sends shivers through Glasgow. He became the embodiment of a terrifying idea, that evil can wear the mask of civility, speaking in polite tones while hiding something monstrous beneath. Today, the Bible John murders remain one of Scotland's greatest unsolved mysteries. They remind us of the limits of past investigations and force us to wonder, could there still be men like him, blending into the crowd, passing by us unnoticed? We may never know who Bible John truly was, but his name will forever haunt the shadowed history of Glasgow, a chilling reminder that some crimes are destined to remain unanswered. 15 stories, 15 names, and behind them, dozens, maybe even hundreds of innocent lives lost, leaving behind questions that have never been answered. What makes these cases so haunting isn't just the crimes themselves, but the silence that followed. Decades of unanswered questions, as if the killers simply vanished into the shadows, leaving behind fear and case files that never found closure. Perhaps it's this very mystery that keeps us searching, keeps us asking, keeps us curious. Will the truth ever come to light? Or will these ghosts of murderers remain forever a part of urban legend, lingering on the edge between fact and myth? What do you think? Could one of them still be out there, living among us today? Share your thoughts below. And if you'd like to continue uncovering more of the world's unsolved mysteries, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story.